This presentation is for the Texas Tech University School of Music Composer Celebration Series, the Zoltan Kodaly Symposium. Kodaly through the eyes of those that knew him, analysis of his professional work, personality, and influence. Kodaly, as we knew him, is a collection of 35 essays originally published in Hungarian as Untitled Chapter in 1979. 10 of the essays were translated into English and published in the Bulletin of the International Kodaly Society between the years 1978 and 1990. The essays provide an opportunity to explore the comprehensive legacy of Zoltan Kodaly through the writings of those that knew him personally. The content analysis of these 10 essays revealed three overarching themes that illuminate Kodaly in terms of his professional work, his personality, and his influence. Kodaly's professional work is further categorized as that of a pedagogue, teacher of composition, ethnomusicologist, and composer-artist. The discussion of Kodaly's personality takes many angles and reveals some contradictory and complementary observations. Kodaly's influence was examined primarily in terms of his leadership. Now I'm going to share with you the authors of those 10 essays that were translated into English from the original 35. 10 were translated into English and published in the Bulletin of the International Kodaly Society. Béla Bartók Jr. is the son of the prominent Hungarian composer, Béla Bartók, and his first wife, Marta Ziegler. In the photo, Bartók Jr. is pictured in the middle. His essay was published in 1978. Or let me say, the English translation was published in the Bulletin in 1978. Doráty studied composition with Kodaly. He was a well-known orchestral conductor. His essay was published in 1989. Ferencik, a conductor, and he was the general music director of the Budapest Opera. His essay was published in 1984. Kadosha studied composition with Kodaly, was known as a composer, and he was a piano faculty member at the Academy of Music. His essay was published in 1984. Keresztúri was Hungarian Minister of Religion and Education. He was a member of the Hungarian Academy of Arts and Sciences. His essay was published in 1990. Molnár studied composition with Kodaly. He was a composer. He was on faculty at the Academy of Music. His essay was published in 1980. And just as a side note, if you have taken some Kodaly certification classes, you might, or even if you haven't, you might know him from his collection, his excellent collection of canons, classical canons, published through Editio Musica Budapest. Nádási studied composition with Kodaly. He was a director of opera, theater, and film. His essay was published in 1981. Shirley studied composition with Kodaly. He was a composer. He's also known for completing Bartók's Viola Concerto. His essay was published in 1979. Sokole studied composition with Kodaly. He's a composer. He was on faculty at the Academy of Music. His essay was published in 1989. And Varjas studied folk music with Kodaly. He was an ethnomusicologist, folklorist. His essay was published in 1979. This will be our first section in Kodaly's professional work, focusing on his work just generally known as a pedagogue. Several authors mention Kodaly's time at the prestigious Eötvös College to be significant in shaping his pedagogy. Doráty noted that Kodaly took teaching very seriously and planned meticulously. He was remembered more for his questioning techniques rather than his traditional lectures. He never enlarged on any subject at length. I don't think he ever spoke longer than 3 minutes in a lesson. He asked a lot of questions. This method exposed unexpected depths and possibilities of learning or acquiring new knowledge. Varyash also remembered Kodai's probing teaching techniques. He educated me and never taught me in the everyday sense of the word. He never lectured me on any subject, even though I was one of his students at the university for 2 years. He didn't expound his knowledge, but probed into mine. Several of Kodai's students commented on his strictness, shortness, and terse comments as a teacher, but his shortness was not perceived as meanness. Molnar remembered, though he was very strict in demanding that the homework be done, he never raised his voice. He stated his requirements in a soft, easy manner, as if it were as natural as breathing or eating. Dorothy elaborated on Kodai's demanding nature. Without being cruel or even without as much as putting it into words, he demanded very much of us. He expected us to do our utmost, and we complied. Kodai helped his students when they had prepared as necessary, but he was not willing to feed them basic information they could acquire on their own. Varyash discussed how Kodai responded to him based on his preparation. Whenever my knowledge proved to be insufficient or wrong, he corrected me. If he had to add a lot, or if I didn't know all the available data, more exactly all that had to be known, he refused to carry on talking to me until I had read the necessary literature. Varyash believed the high standard Kodai held for his students was in itself the best incentive for excellence. Even when the standard was a bit unusual, it still elicited a positive effect. Dorothy stated that for Kodai, everything was possible, and elaborated this point in the following story of how Kodai responded when he was disappointed with a student in class. You don't seem to know all the musical compositions. Please get to know them by next Wednesday. Dorothy goes on to say, what was odd about that was not the absurdity of the task, but that both our rebuked colleague and the rest of us read ourselves half blind by the next Wednesday. Our knowledge of music did increase considerably by the next occasion, even if it still did not encompass all the musical compositions. Sokole told us that Kodai was highly respected, not due to oppressive authority, but by the mental and artistic creativity of his personality, stripping everything to its core. His unrivaled knowledge, taste, and unerring sense of judgment, and his incredible memory. Kodai was known for not talking about himself, and students learned about his greatness through his occasional statements. Dorothy stated, for we hardly heard anything but some chance remarks and short sentences from him during the 4 years. Not only did he know and remember every possible piece of music, but his competence in literature, history, geography, and mathematics, etc., was awe-inspiring. Now the second section focuses on his professional work, but specifically him as a teacher of composition. Kodai's compositional students remembered him with high regard due to his high standards, emphasis on praxis, and his ability to teach students to think about the artistic science of musical composition. Nadashti remembers that he was very effective in helping his students learn about both technical and artistic aspects of composition. The way Kodai illuminated the biology of music is unforgettable for all his pupils. His methodology for teaching this process of illumination is still intriguing to this day. Kadosha recalled Kodai's response to a question regarding his method of teaching. My method is that I have no method. Kadosha discussed how this was true of Kodai because his teaching always started with the music itself, a methodology based on praxis. Kodai used the music to reveal what skills the student needed to know or master, which was a practical and efficient method of teaching. Dorothy also discussed how Kodai emphasized this practical nature in his teaching. Besides being incredibly thoroughgoing, his teaching was completely subjected to the requirements of praxis. He taught theories, not for their own sake, but mainly to demonstrate how a theory could and should be translated into practice. Molnar commented on how emphasis on practical application revealed itself in composition classes. He didn't think much of theoretical circumscriptions, but deemed only practical knowledge useful. His tuition in harmony always ended with exercises in hearing. Everything had to be heard. Only afterwards did we have to put into words what we had heard. Dorothy recalled an experiment at the Liszt Academy in 1921, where students were assigned to a single composition teacher for a 4-year term, with whom they would study counterpoint, form, and orchestration, instead of having different teachers for the various subjects. The students assigned to Kodaly for their 4-year term felt very lucky to have had so much time with him. We remember each other far more vaguely than we remember Kodaly. Kodaly was quite serious, but also included humor in classes as evidenced by Shirley. Shirley's memory of Kodaly dashing a snowball at one of his students before class. Molnar summarized Kodaly's teaching into 2 categories, psychology and training. In terms of psychology, Kodaly measured the task against the student's abilities. He encouraged points where he saw that there was a possibility of progress, but he didn't yield there. His bearing was so simple and definite that I would have been ashamed of myself if I had not been able to give an exact account of what he expected me to learn. Molnar described Kodaly's training work as the insistence of having his students attain a certain level of competence. This was achieved by his willingness to patiently wait while students repeated exercises such as playing choral sequences on the piano, improvising harmonies under given melodies, or orally recognizing harmonic sequences until they reached a satisfactory level. Kadosha remembered how Kodaly continually encouraged the students to learn about other composers. When Kodaly realized Kadosha wasn't familiar with Marenzio's works, his comment, "Don't you know Marenzio? He's worth knowing," compelled Kadosha to find Marenzio's works in the library. Kadosha elaborated, "He did not order me to do something, but he put me on the right track. This was his teaching method." Kadosha also explained how specifically, when teaching composition skills, Kodaly not only threw light upon my mistakes by suggesting a better solution, but also pointed out that my solutions were not natural enough, not spontaneous enough. That is how he trained me to find as simple a formulation as possible. Dorothy elaborated on Kodaly's skill as a composition teacher. He really taught us what was verging on the impossible, how to compose music. He did this by exposing to us not the perennial rules of composition, but its evolution, getting us to understand the immense flexibility of a composition, its reconstructible past, and foreseeable future development. Kodaly was committed to opening his students' minds about composition and music history. Dorothy articulated a valuable lesson Kodaly taught his composition students. He eradicated the theoretical dividing line between old and new. We learned to approach the evolving, changing, living entity of art with understanding and intuition. Kadosha noted that Kodaly had high standards for himself and his composition students. Another great asset of his pedagogy was that he judged his own works by very high standards and expected his pupils to look at their primitive creations with the same demands. Kodaly helped his students raise their standards with his honest and sometimes humorous comments. Usually during class, we listened to the composition exercise of a designated pupil. Then Kodaly asked our opinion. In one case, the experiment of a pupil seemed like a triumphal march with incessant sequences. When he told him our opinion, he added, "Yes, it is like a royal procession at which all the ministers, generals, princes, and princesses, as well as the king, and queen have appeared several times. For heaven's sake, when will a rustic appear? Dorothy remembered Kodai's reaction to a student who had created a habit of composing melancholy songs related to his romantic interest. Kodai put up with the sorrow as long as he could, but one day he could not help asking in a low voice, "Tell me, what does that girl do that you are always so sad?" Even though the humorous comments seemed to be in contrast with Kodai's serious character, the comments revealed his deep commitment to teaching composition. Kodai relayed this commitment and the value of thorough study to his students as remembered by Dorothy. He taught us to respect craftsmanship, to keep the technical apparatus clean, and it was not in vain. I think I am not exaggerating when I say on behalf of all of Kodai's pupils that none of us ever put down a measure that had not been weighed carefully before. Kodai students continued to ask for feedback on their work years after their study with him at the academy. After Kadosha asked for feedback on a composition, he gave his objections willingly, from which I learned far more than I would have from his praises. Dorothy felt that Kodai not only taught his students about the art of composition, but also about the value of effort. He made us realize that it is all the same how much we give of ourselves in weight or mass, as giving everything in us is what counts. A grain of everything is worth more than a ton of something in art and in life. The next section continues the line of study about Kodai's professional work, and this is the third section now, focusing on Kodai as ethnomusicologist. The importance of Ethnomusicologist's influence on Kodai is restated in terms of his ethnomusicological work. Students at the college were deliberately selected from all parts and social strata of Hungary to help them think in terms of the whole country, rather than from their own perceptions and experiences. Kadasturi went on to say, "Here, the students learned from each other and from their teachers that they had to turn to the common people if they wanted to create an autochthonous, real, and authentic Hungarian culture." Kadasturi discussed how artists of this time, including architects, designers, painters, and sculptors, were all searching for inspiration in the villages to help create a genuine Hungarian style. Kodai and other artists working in this mindset set out to find the crystal clear sources from which a new, authentic Hungarian national culture could be developed in Pest. Kodai did not ask the local village teachers to collect or record tunes, but instead, he went himself to the places where the tunes were in use. By collecting songs himself, he got acquainted with folk music in its human context and with the role that it played there. He learned about the life, hardships, and celebrations of the peasantry, which taught him a profound sense of responsibility to them as people, not just source material. Nadashti remembers Kodai's preface to the 1927 recital of his songs. "It is not enough to rush across the village by car. One must enter the door, look around the cottages. There are people living there too, often in physical and spiritual misery, crying to heaven, and yet how much we can learn from them." Baryash recalled Kodai's advice for collecting folk songs, which was very practical in nature. "He advised me to take along a torchlight, as people disliked having to burn their expensive paraffin lamps for too long and preferred talking in the dark. He even lent me his own pendulum metronome, devised particularly for collecting, a tape measure to be wound off a drum on which the metronome units corresponded to the length of the pendulum were indicated. And it made no noise. It didn't disturb the singer." Kodai valued the human experience just as much as the musical materials he was collecting. His respect for the people providing the music was conveyed to his students, and they commented on the simultaneous attention to human care and scientific detail that went into Kodai's ethnomusicological work. Varyash studied folk music at the Academy with Kodai and commented that he was effective in teaching consequent thinking and verification of facts. When I think of Kodai, I always remember him as a scientist, which in my mind is what he was. I think of the personality who led me towards science and the way in which he did it. Kodai taught Varyash the importance of waiting to find proper solutions to his research problems in order not to come to a conclusion too early with potential for error. Varyash shared this story as an example. Even when he got to know the styles, Cherami's folk music, from various publications and completed a study entitled Specific Melody Structure in Cherami's Folk Music, he did not mention the relationship between Hungarian and Cherami's music, as he had not yet come upon direct parallelism in the melodies. Only when he could make reference to a number of parallel melodies did he involve his concept on the relationship between Eastern and the pre-conquest Hungarian folk music style. Kodai taught his students that decisions were best made with larger samples, and he demonstrated a great capacity for waiting, so that conclusions were more likely to be accurate. Kodai's professional work. The fourth section, Kodai as composer artist. Kodai's compositional students also learned about his capacity for waiting with his use of the Latin phrase, nonum premature inanum. His use of the phrase, let it be kept back until the 9th year, communicated the importance of time for reflection in the artistic process. Ferenczi commented on conductors' frequent use of stories to aid performers in bringing a piece of music to life. But Kodai did not use those techniques when working with musicians that were performing his works. Rather, he focused on technical modifications. Ferenczi also remembers Kodai's openness to interpretations. Within reason, he was pleased to hear an individual interpretation in the performance. For example, when we first performed his symphony in Hungary, I asked him to listen to a certain passage towards the end of the 3rd movement, because I thought it would sound well ritenuto. Kodai listened to it and said, it may remain. If he considered somebody worthy of it, he gave him, to all intents and purposes, fairly free rein. Kodai did not like talking or writing about his own works. However, the preface of Summer Night sheds some light on his artistic process. It is only in the preface of Summer Night, published by Universal, that he mentioned that in his opinion, the old material of the work had found its final and perfect form in the later form. But he did not put it quite like this and formulated it in a markedly circumscribed way. It had gained its Chladni figure. Molnar found significant insight into this reference of the Chladni figure, which referred to the acoustical study of molecules in natural formations. Molnar commented, from this we may draw the conclusion that in every work Kodai tried to construct in the same manner as nature itself. Sokole remembered the impact of Kodai's choral works for children and female voices, taking deep root in him as a child. He felt the purity of sound and the special flavor of the poetic language wrapped him in the atmosphere of the village. I have never ceased to feel that Kodai's choral works for children's and female voices are the quintessence of imagination, artistic invention, and word painting, and the repositories of the symbols of the Hungarian spirit. Kodai's ability to combine his craft of composition with his folk music expertise resulted in music that shaped souls. Kodai elevated to the height of classicism the inestimable richness of folk art. He kneaded it into a nutrient for the soul, achievable to all, available to all. I don't think I have to emphasize how decisive childhood experiences are. Kodai himself said, "Music is food for the soul and nothing can replace it." Kodai was trained at Etverst College to think and learn about Hungary as a whole. And it's possible this holistic way of thinking encouraged him to use diverse music from Hungary's history. He discovered and used as a source of inspiration not only the folk song, but the old art music, as well, where he found fine berbunkos music and pseudo-Hungarian songs too. In other words, he cherished all the values of the Hungarian past. Perhaps it's due to the use of music from Hungary's past that the Hungarian people found Kodai's compositions to be a source of unity and hope for their future. Nádasdy discussed Kodai's music in the time of war. To us, the audience, the ruin of the whole of old Hungary seemed to loom up. And yet, even Kodai's music was not the voice of the despair, but that of strength, of being obliged, first and foremost, to hold out and to survive, for the new nation was already in motion, the nation of the approaching Hungarian psalm, of the children's choruses, and of the spinning room. It was for them as a consolation that the composer and poet wrote his music. Kereszturi remembered Kodai as an artist with understanding and a sense of proportion, as traits that lifted the artist above his self. Kodai valued originality and artistry, which is interesting in the light of the previous discussion about utilizing historic music as source material for new compositions. Molnar noted, with him, individual originality came first and foremost and determined the value of a work of art. It's likely the originality in how these old materials were used to create new compositions was the artistic measure Kodai took to heart. Ferencik described an interaction with Kodai that touched him deeply, an experience that illuminates an artist in connection with his innermost artistic inspiration. The scene of my most beautiful experience connected with Kodai took place at his flat. I was shown in and waited for him in the hall. He was at the piano in the corner room. He may have been dealing with Bach because he was playing a Bach melody, I don't remember what. He played just the melody, but very beautifully. Then he looked at me and simply said, "That's what makes life worth living." The second section, Kodai's personality, contradictory and complementary observations. Kodai's personality was a dominant topic in the writings of those that knew him. His personal attributes were closely linked to his work, and several writers commented about their inability to separate Kodai as a person, teacher, colleague, researcher, artist, friend, or public leader because his personality was a strong unifying presence in each role. Through these writings, we find some contradictions in the descriptions of his personality, which help us understand the complexity of the man. Some aspects of Kodai's personality were illuminated in the previous comments from his students. He was well known for his taciturnity, but it's likely that only those who knew him were able to see the richness of his personality beyond the short, stern comments. Sokole remembers his irony and sharp, pungent remarks were not welcomed by everyone. I soon realized that his roughness hid a shy and warm heart. His love was austere, but sometimes he was extremely kindly. Kodai was contradictorily described as having both a closed and open nature. He projected a closed nature through his shortness and silence. His personality had to be deciphered. He did not reveal much about himself, for he could also create an icy atmosphere around him. where any kind of conversation became impossible. Dorothy also commented on Kodai's silence. Never again have I heard a louder silence than Kodai's. Nadashti remembered Kodai's comment about silence during an interview on the occasion of his birthday. People talk a lot to us. I, however, am aware of the great value of silence. Nadashti also commented on Kodai's silence. Indeed, having known Kodai for over 40 years, I experienced how silence imbued him with radiance, his legendary silence. Even though Kodai spoke few words, the words he used were significant. His rarely uttered sentences were concise, but formed from weighty particles. Dorothy spoke about the relationship Kodai constructed between teacher and pupil that illustrates both closed and open perceptions. Obviously, he had a strong personality, stronger than any of his pupils. We would happily have taken shelter under his wing had he allowed us to do so. But he did not let us get too close to him, which he did so virtuosically that he did not make us feel the distance between teacher and pupil to be an unbridgeable gulf. Kadosha described Kodai's openness in terms of his willingness to hear other viewpoints. He was always willing to debate and respected other people's points of view. In fact, he expected one to take a stand for one's opinions and beliefs. There were difficult times sometimes when I felt I could not fully accept what he professed. However, he always listened to opposing views and was never annoyed with anybody for not accepting his own. Kodai's openness towards artistic interpretation of his compositions was previously discussed, but it's worth mentioning here to reinforce this element of his personality. Kodai was known for being choosy about the people allowed to be close to him. Bedensik revealed how Kodai's openness grew as relationships deepened. It was only with the occasional flash, a sentence or two, that he made one feel that he had allowed you closer to himself. By this, he did not bestow favors, simply selected the people who were closer to him. Our relationship grew slowly more friendly. Kodai's openness was demonstrated through his helpfulness for friend and colleague Bela Bartok. He opened his home to Bartok on regular occasions, presented Bartok's compositions to the public, wrote enthusiastically about Bartok's work in the press, and was genuinely glad at his successes. The essays reveal the generous help that Kodai gave to Bartok was not isolated to this one particular friendship, but that he was generous and helpful to many. Kadosty notes the perceived contradictions in his generous nature. He was no master of compliments or commonplace courtesy. He rarely brought flowers to the hostess or sent sweets. Very seldom did he kiss someone's hand. He shook hands instead. But if he saw it fit, he gave away an expensive piano or flute and a large sum of money without a second thought. This beneficence and readiness to help was very typical of him. He was self-oblivious at such moments. Shirley recalled two stories that illuminated Kodai's warm generosity. When discussing the possibility of studying composition with Kodai privately, Kodai answered, "I know you can't afford to pay my usual tuition fees. On the other hand, I won't accept lower, so you'll pay nothing." Decades later in America, Shirley invited Kodai to lecture with his American students. Shirley collected an honorarium fee from the students to give to Kodai, but the check was returned to Shirley with Kodai's signature the next day. Varyash shared a story about publication that has become known as the Kodai Varyash textbook, which also illustrates his generosity. The royalties fixed by the publisher were very low, both for me and proportionally for him too. It is out of the question, he exclaimed, and fought for higher royalties on the basis of the fact that the work would be used as a textbook, which is what actually happened. As it was his study, the sum of the royalty was the highest possible. Having settled the matter, he got the whole sum allocated to me. When I tried to remonstrate by stuttering my arguments into the phone, he cut me short. You have worked on it. Not only do the essays reveal behaviors that contribute to both closed and open perceptions, they also reveal stories that describe Kodai as both very serious and very funny. Molnar described Kodai as purposeful. No hesitation could ever be perceived, and every word and movement was definite. Dorothy confirmed Kodai's serious demeanor. Kodai wasn't what you would call an easy person. Whatever he set himself to, he took seriously. We've previously discussed humor in Kodai's composition classes, Snowball, Melancholy Melodies, and Royal Marches, but these were not the only humor stories included in the essays. One day I arrived at the composition classes at the Academy with a plastered arm in a sling. Kodai looked at me grimly and asked, "What's happened to you?" "I've broken my arm, sir." "How did you do that?" "I fell off the horse." "Why did you get on?" "One just can't sit about all the time," I said, a bit irritated. He looked at me for a full moment and then said, "You sit on a horse too." Years later, Dorothy conducted the gramophone recording of the Peacock Variations with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Dorothy recalls Kodai's response after listening to the recording. He wrote back, "I received the Peacock record with thanks. The funeral march was so fast that the body fell out of the coffin. Since then, I've always conducted the funeral march at a slower pace, lest I should disturb the eternal rest of the departed." I'll pause here and tell you about a footnote. I found one of Dorothy's recordings with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, 1954 recording. The beginning of this variation that Kodai is speaking about, variation 13, the funeral march, this tempo, what I perceived it to be, was approximately 76. I found another recording where Dorothy was conducting. This was in 1969, so years later. This recording was with the Hungarian State Opera. And at the beginning of variation 13, the tempo was significantly slower. I heard it to be about 62. So there's some evidence that Dorothy really did take his comments to heart. Generally speaking, humor is effective because it's rooted in truth. Nadashti described Kodai as a truth seeker, and it's obvious from the writings that he was a bluntly honest man. Sokole relayed a story where Kodai's truthful feedback is set in a humorous comment. "He often came to my premieres after the first night of the Blood Wedding. 'Why do you write piccolo so often in your orchestra? Do you want to wake those who have fallen asleep?' His short, aphoristic sentences always hit home." This story illustrates how Kodai, using humor, was able to tell the truth about his opinion of the composition, which penetrated to Sokole's heart. Kodai was honest about his opinion on every topic, including a healthy lifestyle. Bartók Jr. remembered Kodai as one of the first to try out any suggestions which seemed to be good about a healthier way of life. At that time, the Kodais were vegetarians. They kept as much as possible to uncooked things, ate sour milk, salads, etc., and tried to convince others to do the same. Though Father liked the idea, he was unable to change the diet he had been accustomed to. On the other hand, it was a godsend that he could try it out on me. Thus, in the wake of Kodai's influence, I grew up without eating meat. Taking the air and sunbathing appealed to all of us, though, and Kodai also showed us the newest trends in physical culture. He skated regularly, and I always thought of him as a man of strong physique. Molnar commented on how Kodai thought of fitness as an artistic duty. One of his basic principles was that a useful contribution could be made to art only with a healthy, strong body resistant to exertion. Attention to health and fitness was not a short-term fad for Kodai. Rather, it was a lifelong commitment. He refused to give up his habit of going swimming every day, having massage, walking, and doing gymnastics exercises until the very last time. Kedestu shared a memory that exemplified Kodai's ability in gymnastics. Then we talked of gymnastics. I was a good gymnast. I used to be junior champion. He asked me, "Can you stand on your hands in this armchair?" I tried by standing on my head and holding the arms of the chair with my hands. He waved his hand in scorn as if to say, "That's nothing." And he stood on his hands on the arms of the chair without leaning to anything. He was quite a few years my senior. Sokole commented on Kodai's fitness at his advanced age. He was a master of preserving not only his mental, but also his physical fitness. We, busy, overwrought people booked up for weeks ahead, have not time for anything. We do not walk as much a year as he did in a week. Once I accompanied him on a walk in the Buddha Hills. I was completely exhausted after trekking, and especially climbing that rocky region. He was fitter at 84 than I, the 35-year-old. Kedes today explained why Kodai was so keen on health and exercise. Kodai had made up his mind. He had so much to do, he would have to live very long. To this end, he lived a very healthy life, or what was regarded healthy at that time. Kodai committed to a healthy lifestyle so that he could have many years to accomplish his goals. Kedes continued, his unexceptional purposefulness, economical way of life, perseverance, insistence on certain rules of life were typical of him all his life through. Sokole also mentioned Kodai's plan for a long life. It is well worth a long thought that despite the hard work he did, he could plan his life on a long scale. It was one of the aspects of his versatility that he could live perfectly. Sokole discussed one aspect that many struggle with today, the elusive work-life balance. I think not only his art, but also his life carries a meaningful message for the hurried people of the modern age. In me, he elicits nostalgia, a desire for the unattainable harmony. Kodai was able to achieve not only a work-life balance, but a work-life harmony, where each aspect of life complemented the other. The third section is Kodai as leader. Kedes described the article Medsheg that Kodai wrote for the Magyar Szemle journal in 1940 as centrally important to understanding Kodai's commitment to leadership in Hungary. Kedes stated, "It is the credo of the teacher of the nation who refused to leave this country because he felt he had been given a mission to fulfill here." Kodai was viewed as teacher of a nation, and he was committed to teaching the Hungarian people about their rich cultural history, which would serve as a strong foundation to reach towards their full potential. Kedes' statement also emphasized Kodai's deep roots in Hungary and his commitment to serve the people who shared those roots with him. As in his classroom, Kodai was continually working to raise the musical standards in every situation where he could have influence. Nadasti was in training as an opera director at the Hungarian State Opera House. When asked to study with Kodai, Nadasdy was in training as an opera director at the Hungarian State Opera House when he asked to study with Kodály. And the response demonstrated Kodály's commitment to Hungarian art and culture. The trouble is that through the Opera House, you know a lot about musical life, more than you should. It's just the music itself that you don't know. This is a typically Hungarian disease. We are the original home of dilettantism. It ought to be stopped. Kodály was willing to invest time and energy to develop Nadasdy's musicianship. Even though Nadasdy was not a composition student at the academy, Kodály was willing to teach him in order to shape and deepen the future musical life of the Hungarian State Opera. Both Dorati and Kadosha mentioned Kodály's leadership through his writings to the press in defense of his pupils' works. He was committed to working on behalf of those that were making great efforts in new art. He was not only an artist, but a combatant of culture as well. Kodály's method of fighting was to educate. Molnár stated, he was steered by this basic idea. Hungarian audiences are best able to understand a Hungarian composer. Therefore, these audiences must be educated in order to really understand Hungarian composers' works. Kodály was a master delegator, and he worked with students, friends, and colleagues to implement his plan. He knew that the finest plan remains a plan if there is no one to implement it. That's why he had trained so many active scholars, researchers, teachers, musicians. Molnár remembered a great lesson from Kodály regarding one of the components of his master plan, teaching musicianship through solfeggio. After teaching the subject for 20 years, Molnár complained to Kodály that he was feeling as if his lessons were boring and getting into a rut, and that he wished to teach other subjects. Kodály's response was firm. Kodály declared that for a Hungarian music teacher, the finest task was to teach solfeggio. I should have considered it a great compliment that he expected me to take a central role in this course. But at that time, I was most ambitious and could not survey the comprehensive significance of Kodály's plans. These strong words illustrate how Kodály delegated tasks he believed to be critical to improving the artistic standard in Hungary, and that he insisted that they be taken seriously by his colleagues. Kodály also exhibited strength in softer ways, as Kereszteri remembered. I saw him argue with Révai and Rákosi in an almost voiceless but firm tone. I saw him do his utmost to get papers of protection for his wife's family. He helped me when, as a minister, I had to reorganize Hungary's system of education, including Hungarian musical education, from singing at school to the reform of the Academy of Music. These examples show Kodály's leadership and the strength of his words and actions. Kodály led by example. He held himself to a high standard, and this standard served as a model to all that knew him. His deep roots in Hungary fertilized his bold vision for an elevated Hungarian culture, and his actions consistently aligned with this mission. Kodály's immediate impact on the lives of the writers of these essays was significant, but perhaps more interesting was his impact on their lives years later. Sokole commented, "He is a great example for me, whose image is not fading with the passing of years, but is growing even sharper." Dorati remembered Kodály as a teacher in two phases of his life. Actually, I was Kodály's pupil twice. Once when he taught me, and then again when I grasped what he had taught me. Time helped them digest the enormity of Kodály's impact on their lives. Kodály's influence was not only significant for those that knew him personally, but also for the country as a whole. Kodály was a giant of the spirit. I think the name Zoltán Kodály is a symbol, the symbol of Hungarian culture, the symbol of the spiritual rise of our nation, the symbol of a more cultured and a truer Hungary. Sokole lamented that in the present day, we still haven't fully grasped the enormity of Kodai's teachings. Hungarian musicians must often blush with shame, realizing that while he lived, we celebrated him. But self-importantly, we believe that we have left him behind when we have not caught up to him yet. This comment illustrates the potential to continue to learn from Kodai, both from his writings and from those that knew him. Kodai showed us through his example how to be a great musician, researcher, teacher, leader, and how to lead a harmonious life. He has taught us that even today, through those that knew him, there is more to be learned, expressed, and enjoyed if we continue to raise our standards to fully realize our potential. The profoundest lesson we learned from Kodai was the realization of what we could expect of ourselves. Thank you for watching and listening to this presentation. If you would like to learn more or see the full details of this paper and the citations, it has been printed in the Bulletin of the International Kodaly Society. Also, you could contact me at the University of Cincinnati.